Again, good afternoon and welcome to the third Kentucky Summit, a statewide strategy for Riverport investment. We are currently monitoring participants coming on. We're going to give them one more minute and then we'll go ahead and get started.
Good morning, Jim.
Good morning. Good afternoon. It's 12:01. We've allowed some time for folks to come in. There's still some more folks signing in as we speak. We're going to go ahead and get started with our fourth session. Again, I'd like to welcome everybody to the third Kentucky Summit on statewide strategy or Riverport investment on behalf of the Kentucky Transportation Cabinet. Just want to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure that we have the best experience possible. If you notice with the Zoom platform, you have a little control box that looks like what you see on the screen. On the far left, you have a mute and unmute button. So we'd like everybody at this time, if you're not a speaker, to try and mute so that we don't get interruptions from phone calls or background noise. Also, you'll see the camera button looks like a little camera right next to the mute button. Please use that when you're speaking or if you're asking a question so we can see your face and so that it's easier to convey that and also to recognize you as a participant. And in the middle, you have a chat button, and that chat box is used for asking questions of the speakers, the presenters. We can also use it if you're having some technical difficulties, to speak with the host of the Zoom platform and be able to try and accommodate you in that form. The reactions button that you see down here at the end looks like a smiley face. Use that also to raise your hand or to add an emoji that to the presenters or to the speakers at the time. And at the top, you see the little grid and change your view. That allows you to better see the speakers or to see their presentation better. You can flip through those and try and change your view of the presentation in the Zoom platform. We've gone through this morning session, which was anticipating the evolution of freight commodities, conversation with corn, soy, and aluminum representatives. Ended at 11. We had a brief break to get some lunch and stretch your legs. And now we're at the fourth session, which is the modeling scenarios and Riverport investment strategies. And this session will go from noon to 1:30. The speakers that we have today for you, Chandler Duncan, who's the project manager from Metro Analytics. Chandler will be the first speaker on the agenda, and Noel Cuomo, who's a key technical advisor with a strong background in maritime planning. The agenda is understanding ports investment needs, the breakdown of planned investments into three basic categories, and consideration of potential funding sources going forward, and the investment strategy considerations. So that being said, I would like to turn it over to Noel at this time to introduce their session and get this thing underway.
Thank you, Jimmy, very much. Greatly appreciate the introduction, as well as mentioning the agenda and where we've come from so far, as well as past sessions, to put this in light of the bigger picture. Today, we're going to cover, as it was Jimmy covered, is the sessions entitled Modeling Scenarios and Riverport Investment Strategies. And we're going to cover the port's investment needs that we've assessed, the breakdown of those planned investments, what they've told us they need essentially in the next 5 years. And we're going to break that into three categories that you will see, and as well as consideration of potential funding sources. And then, of course, going forward, considerations for an investment strategy or strategies as we're developing task memo 4. As Chandler already mentioned, there's myself and, as Jimmy already mentioned, there's myself and Chandler Duncan. I myself have been around the industry for about 25 years, mostly doing maritime planning. I've delved into other parts, of course, from environmental to resilience, which I think gives me a fairly comprehensive background to understand the needs in this case. Most notably from my background is the fact that I helped start the Marine Highway Program, what we used to call short sea shipping, and even looked at short sea shipping before we had that program when I worked for John Vickerman's group many years ago. So I do enjoy maritime planning, and I think that there's a lot of possibility for Kentucky to make it a world-class port conglomerate, essentially, because it's a matter of ports working together. Chandler, did you want to jump in and talk about your background?
Yeah, obviously I'm the project manager on this project, and I have really my background is mostly in multimodal transportation planning and investment management. So my background really has to do with quantifying the impacts and benefits of transportation investment packages and looking at the trade-offs and how we understand transportation needs, how we understand the payoffs that can come with investing in transportation, and understanding the different ways that we can frame our transportation choices. So in this particular discussion, I'll be talking a little bit about how we take this conversation we've been having with the Riverports and how we sort of combine it into, a larger story about, what is really, what are we talking about investing in when we talk about Kentucky's Riverports within the context of this larger economic context that we've been learning about throughout the study, and where is that leading us in terms of what we're going to be saying in our final report and our marketing toolkit, and what we could be buying with our investment, and hopefully that leading us into some really good discussion about what we really want for our product here to be saying both to the Riverports and to people who are going to be investing in them.
Thank you, Chandler. So I think Chandler hit it on the head at the very end, saying, which is our goal here today, not just to present to you and be the complete and monopolizing the time, but to get your feedback at the end from everybody that's here today to have a vibrant discussion. So that being said, Jimmy, if you don't mind advancing the slides, greatly appreciate it. And Chandler, please go ahead.
Okay, for those who were at our initiation meeting at the beginning of the summit, we talked about the fact that one of the things that we really want to engage in this summit is looking at making the case for investment, the business case for investment in the ports. And a big part of that is understanding what the investment looks like and understanding that within this market study that we're doing at this juncture, at this point in time, we need to take what we have learned in the last two summits that we had and what we've learned in all of the economic intelligence and the forecasting that we've gotten, and understand what that means for port investment. We talk about things like the fact that our coal market is not going to be in the future what it was. There are emerging opportunities, there are new commodities, there are new markets that could come up, but that means that we have to invest something to be able to make ourselves available for those markets. It also means that we're going to have to probably capture some different markets. Technology is changing. The same things that we've always preserved and used in the past may not be adequate for our future needs. Some of our assets are just getting older, and our competitors, other states, as well as other industries, are moving forward. And what does it mean for us to do that? So one of the things that we come to at this particular juncture in our overall project is an opportunity to have a forward-looking discussion about investment. And really what we're doing in this session today is going from having a lot of discussions about, well, I really think that I really would like to invest in this thing, and I know that the other port over there wants to invest in that thing, and everybody's got some things on their list of things that they'd like to get done or things that they would like to invest in or a grant they'd like to go and get. But what does it all add up to? What is all of that investment and all of those things that we think we ought to be investing in? What does that all add up to in terms of a business case for Kentucky's Riverports as a system to comprise a really strategic, compelling investment for money that could be out there that could actually pay back in Kentucky's economy in spades? How can that work? And that's what today is about. And that leads us into our ability to tell the story and all of the deliverables that come out at the end. And so today is about that story. It's about a story that began back when we first looking at the role of Riverports in the economy. It continued as we started looking at forecast and change. It continued throughout the summer as we were having a lot of individual discussions with ports about what they wanted to invest in and what they saw as the potential. and it's going to continue moving forward into the final product that we end up with. So that's what today is all about. Role of investment analysis within the Riverport market study. Next slide. So coming in there, we talk about the idea of investment strategies and packages. And the reason why we do that, the reason why, for example, today we don't have a discussion where we put up a big laundry list of everything that we've talked to every port about when we visited all the ports, and we don't put up every single thing that everybody said that they wanted, is because one, it would probably be a little bit mind-boggling to see everything that we could invest in that everybody wanted. But the real reason why we do this, we talk about investment strategies and packages, is we talk about rolling those things up into some buckets, more or less. And one of the reasons why we do that is to combine the Riverport needs to reflect overall investment levels, to start thinking system-wide about investment in the ports. And that meaning to say that there are objectives that can be accomplished for the Kentucky River ports as a system. They can benefit as a system, compete as a system, and there can be a stronger case for a big investment in the river ports as a system than there would necessarily be for any one particular standalone investment. And some of the objectives exist as a system because all of these river ports participate in Kentucky's economy that faces a lot of the common economic conditions that we've seen in the last two summits and that we've been talking about in some other sessions. So we look at these to try to look at these packages by combining together what we see. Another reason why we look at investment in terms of strategic packages is it enables us to look at funding sources holistically. Because if we can look at needs and investment opportunities as a system whole, we can also look at funding sources and say, well, if on the one hand, you get a big number, but you also start looking at, okay, well, where are the funding streams that can be available that can cover us as a whole system, or that we could qualify for as a whole system? And how can we work together in a coordinated fashion to start making those streams of money available to be able to do the kind of things that our peers and competitors across the country are doing? And if we look at the amount of money we're looking for and places to get it, we can start actually strategically working together to get that, make that possible. Another reason we look at investment packages strategically is that it recognizes that while an individual project or component may have a small return on investment, when taken together, a compelling business case emerges. What I mean by that is that there might be one individual piece of infrastructure that you would not be able to justify, even for a grant program, that might not, if you looked at it in cost benefit, return on investment terms, you'd say it doesn't make sense to do that. But if you understand that that investment actually enables another investment, or it actually is part of a larger project that enables either the port to do something, or perhaps even the overall Riverport economy to do something, then you realize that actually that one little project that might not look very important if taken alone actually has importance, as part of a bigger picture. So looking at investment packages allows us not to get lost in, the idea that one piece may not look important, but we look at a system and say, okay, when you put them together, we see the importance of things. The final reason that we look at this in terms of investment packages or strategies is that the benefits can serve as a basis to articulate wider benefits, jobs, earnings, business sales. When we get into our final report, as we start putting things out at the end of this study, we want to be able to talk about how many jobs we can create in Kentucky through our investment in Riverports, how much earnings, how much business sales, how much future contribution to Kentucky's gross domestic product can be made. And the issue is that often one project, even a big project, may not create more than a handful of jobs. But the overall Riverport system, when you look downstream, down the value chain, you can actually start to see a fairly significant piece of Kentucky's economy. Some of y'all probably remember at the first summit, Derek Cutler had a presentation about when you look downstream at everything that the Riverport system touches today, you get a pretty big piece of the economy. And when you look at everything that we invest in and everything that accomplishes, when it all works together, you see a piece of the economy starting to come into shape that you wouldn't necessarily see if you just looked at individual projects. So a lot of what today's session is all about is starting to to roll these investments together to look at the kind of things that they can accomplish. Next slide. So when we talk about the way that we looked at port investment opportunities in sort of framing today's discussion, we talked, there are kind of two sides of the equation. On the one hand, an investment strategy obviously has, what are you spending the money on? What are the needs or what are the costs, the outlays? The process, as many people here have been involved with throughout the summer, there have been a lot of strategic discussions and interviews that this team has been having with individual ports, as well as collectively dating back to earlier summits and a lot of one-on-one and port visits, where we've been talking and having dialogue about what the needs are, what the opportunities are, what kind of infrastructure would we like to be investing in, but also why would we like to invest in that? What do we think we can get for that? And we've had a lot of strategic dialogue leading to that. The focus has been both on programming future needs in terms of market forecasts, but also existing conditions, and saying, well, given what we've seen in the changing markets, that informs that discussion about, well, God, I might really need this. I thought I needed that, but I might need something else if I'm going to have to handle a different commodity, or if I'm going to have to appeal to a different market. I might have to handle my commodities, or I might have to handle my freight differently in the future because the technology is changing. And of course, you still got your preservation, which is like, well, I just got to replace some stuff. I got to paint some stuff. I got to cut grass. I got to do certain things. And so when you put it all together, you kind of have needs that could include outlays you got to make just to keep what you got, outlays that you got to do in order to optimize performance. You spend some money and it just saves money right there at the port and allows you to operate better, even if it doesn't change your market position. And then you've got some other things, and the ones we're going to talk a lot about, I think, in our discussion today are, well, we make some investments and they can enhance our market position. There are some investments that could actually give us a chance to land more product at the port, to capture new customers, and they could give us an opportunity to compete differently, to change that baseline forecast we looked at in Summit 2, to possibly capture something from another mode, from another market. Those are ones that are going to have a lot of strategic significance, but also higher dollar investments. So that's how we looked at different things that could account for how we would spend our investment overall. The benefits and impacts, we talk about benefits that represent, we're talking today about benefits that accrue everywhere. When we invest in riverports in Kentucky, it doesn't just benefit Kentucky's economy, it can benefit the whole country. The reality is that if using a Kentucky riverport actually is more efficient than using a riverport somewhere else in America, if you actually can make it less costly to move goods by using Kentucky riverport, you generate a benefit to the whole United States. And it's important to quantify that whole benefit, because when you go to get grant funding and things like that, that whole benefit is ultimately what you get evaluated based on. The kind of sources of benefit that we think about for today's conversation have to do with ongoing use of the ports. There's some benefit just by the fact that you spend some money and you're able to stay in business and keep moving the product, obviously. You also have other sources of benefit, like I had mentioned before, that, okay, it costs you a fraction of what it used to cost because you have new machinery, better equipment. You can just do what you do more efficiently, even if you don't change the market position, but you can quantify that in terms of dollars, a stream of dollars over the years. You also have sources of benefit that include that modal efficiency that you get, because you don't have to have all those truck miles, or maybe even you don't even have to have the waterway miles, because you're getting something at a better location, something is more efficient. And those are some of the bigger ones. So there are three different sources of benefit that we look at depending on the nature of what you're investing in. And these benefits, again, will provide a basis as we get into our final report to, these will be dollars as we talk today, but we need to remember as we're talking today, when we go out and make the business case, that when we walk away from here and we go into what we're going to go and give back as our final report, we're going to go back and look at how do these dollars of benefit get absorbed in Kentucky's economy to create jobs, create business, create GDP, create things that everybody in Kentucky cares about, and really that everybody in the country cares about. So the benefits that we talk about today are really just the beginning of a larger equation that is going to make the case for what we're investing in, and why people maybe who never even touched the Riverport economy will care about this discussion after we finish today. Next slide. So understanding the Riverport investment needs, I'll turn this over to Noel to talk a little bit more about what we've learned in the conversations we've had and what's in these packages. So Noel, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Chandler. Without a doubt, the discussions with the port director, some of which are here today, has been invaluable and extremely interesting. So having myself, as I mentioned, done short sea shipping, and to understand that, as Chandler was addressing, is we have all these line items. We have line items and line items. You can't do one, as they might think of it initially, a project, buying some equipment without doing a complementary improvement in some fashion, the land that goes with it, something to that effect, or a warehouse improvement. But that being said, is we had to bring these all together into what makes sense as a larger project. In most cases, it boiled down to having the projects by cargo type and then by port, or by port and then cargo type, however you want to think of it. But essentially that totaled up to about almost $200 million of needs that are being projected in the next 5 years. So that's a lot of money. We do see a lot of different state peer programs that Jimmy will be covering later, that you'll see the amounts that they provide to their ports or make available. Not saying that's something Kentucky doesn't do, but simply saying that there's money out there. There's the federal dollars we'll cover in a few minutes. As I mentioned, we also were considering commodities. So we weren't just considering the cargo types, of course, part of that discussion, but in order to determine these direct benefits at first, was looking at the commodities and where they're going from and to, and of course, these improvements being on-site and off-site, as well as to clarify current commodities, but also new commodities. In the case, we have what is being now considered the Western Kentucky Regional Riverport Authority, as it's being developed, a port that doesn't exist at this time. But in contrast to Paducah, for example, you see up in the top right, that simply we were looking at new commodities, origins and destinations, and looking at the benefits from, if not, they would go by another mode, in contrast to utilizing the central Mississippi River Valley. Next slide, please. So considering those needs and trying to figure out a way to think of them, right? Instead of, Chandler touched on a few of these keywords, painting the shed, cutting the grass, something like that. We most, of course, focus on infrastructure and assets. But in short, we looked at them in 3 different ways. One is, what are the maintenance projects? What does it take for you to at least keep functional at this time, in contrast to improving your port efficiency, the port's efficiencies, reducing operating costs, enhancing what they can do, and then not changing really market dynamics. And then number 3, what we think of as strategic investments to not only preserve your market position, but also to capture more market position. If it's modal share, if it's a lower cost that really helps you, it's buying the land that truly increases the capacity of the port. And of course, then you rely on the market dynamics at that point beyond that to say, hey, can you leverage this? And that's where the prior scenarios came into play, as well as the funding that Jimmy will later talk about. So on a last note is, of course, as you move up this chain from 1 to 2 to 3, is you're increasing your costs. But therefore, as you'll see later, it becomes a matter of, well, do you get the returns that are comparable to those costs? Next slide, please. And Chandler, please jump in at any time. So as Chandler was addressing in a different way up front, was we have user benefits and then the wider impacts. The user benefits amount to the dollars. As I mentioned, with current and future commodities diverting to the water mode or the improvement that's made, how is that equating to some kind of transportation benefit? Considering, of course, the mode and the distance and comparing those for the most part. Wider impacts, whereas some of you may know the transportation benefits feed into to determine, include those jobs, earnings, and sales, the economic impacts. And therefore, of course, to determine a benefit cost ratio is bringing those back to the present value, which is in this case, 2019 dollars. But that being said, is we weren't just doing this, with, hey, we know how to do benefit cost analysis. It's important to us to consider what is the current guidance, given that it's been great since Tiger 1 first came out, that we looked at and are leveraging the USDOT, or better said, Maritime Administration, that also leverages the Office of the Secretary of Transportation's guidance on benefit cost analysis that you'll see in a second. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned with that guidance, the Maritime Administration, and of course, for those of you who know, that's basically part of USDOT and the PIDP program, accounts or takes into account 4 BCR, BCA ranges, less than 1, 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 3, and 3 and greater. We essentially considered that in looking at the Riverport projects. Again, we didn't consider, as Chandler referenced earlier, a BCA or BCR for each and every line item. It was important to group these into larger projects. What made sense? You have a commodity coming to the port, it's coming from somewhere, going to somewhere, or it's not coming through the port yet and could come through the port. Well, again, what's that direct transportation benefit? So we grouped them a little bit differently, less than 1.5 or so. You'll see in a few minutes, 1.5 to 3 and greater than 3. And I don't want to read the slides. I will read these to you. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned with goods movement, and as many of you are familiar, now this does come from the OKI Regional Freight Plan, but many are familiar with the Freight Analysis Framework, a similar type map, what we know as the heart attack maps from a couple of years ago, the terminology. We looked at the goods movement, literally asking origins and destinations, but if it wasn't clear, or in the case of a port that is still developing or looking to develop a new market, then we looked at the Transearch data. And while that is existing data, we looked at what that told us from an historic point of view and current point of view for volumes. But then, of course, the trick was, well, we have an improvement. So what do we think this project will do? Will it simply be a diversion, or will it be a bump up, for example, due to the new type of service? And as Chandler mentioned, demonstrating the benefits from a national perspective, excuse me. Next slide, please. Thank you. So we did, of course, consider, for those of you who know freight pretty well, water, rail, and truck. Air was not a consideration here. And then it was the practical diversion. It wasn't just thinking what is completely conceivable. And for those of you who know transportation very well, transportation boils down to 2 elements, time and money. That applies to passengers as well as goods movement. So as a matter of looking at what we understood from talking to the port directors, and of course, taking into account prior port visits, and essentially thinking, does this make sense? Where are the markets? Looking at the maps, understanding what Transearch data tells us. And then, of course, as I mentioned, what the port directors were informing us of. And then considering, of course, the forecast scenarios that were previously done. So all this, of course, is going to wrap up in the end into that task memo 5, the final report. But to give you an idea that all this is being considered and growing as this project has progressed. Next slide, please. So that being said, the first 3 number columns are essentially 1, 2, and 3. So we have different infrastructure types that has been considered in the past, rail access, services technology, but this is looking at it from the standpoint of each line item effectively. So line item 1, for example, the preservation, maintenance or no growth, business as usual, as you can see here, totals up to just under $16 million, broken out, as you can see here, by these different factors: warehousing, waterfront infrastructure, painting the shed, fixing the roof, simply keeping things going for the most part. But then you want to optimize port efficiency. Well,
and we should mention that this table is presenting investment requirements or investment needs by objective from all sources. So this is not just from the Kentucky program, obviously. This is from all of the sources that play into the capital program.
Right. Thank you, Chandler. So going up, it does jump fairly drastically, if you will, from use that word, optimize port efficiency, going from just under 16 million to just over 82 million. But then you don't have as big a bump, and you'll see in a few minutes when we cover the BCAs broken out in this fashion, relative to preserving or capturing new market position of just over 98 million, those total needs being about $196 million. What's interesting is how much money is out there that you'll see in a few minutes. And this essentially that as much as you might say, wow, we have $500,000 that Kentucky provides annually through its grant program. Well, that's part of the issue, is looking at what are the benefits ultimately to all funding these needs. But more importantly is that there is a lot of money out there that can be tapped into, as Paducah knows and other ports have known from capturing in the past, for example, Marine Highway grant money, for example.
Yeah, and let me just to clarify the way that these are presented, is that the business as usual, basically that $15 million represents the outlay associated with the identified preservation needs of the ports. The $82 million is the additional investments that can be made that would actually allow the ports to operate competitively, efficiently, without any money lost due to lost efficiency, even though it wouldn't really change the market position a whole lot. But that's an additional 82 million on top of the 15 million. And then the 98 million there is an additional 98 million that would really start to change the market dynamic and potentially, move the needle a lot on how competitive you are and how much business you're doing. And so if you added the 15, the 82, the 98, that's where you start getting the 196, because these are incremental numbers. So in other words, the 98 is not inclusive of the 15, just to clarify how to read the table.
Thank you, Chandler. Next slide, please. So this is simply a quick breakout of those three different categories. You're only looking at, so you understand the complexity, that you're only looking at less than 10% for that business as usual. You're going of that pie, you have 42% that optimizes the port efficiency of the 196 million, and then 50%, half, to preserve or capture market share. Next slide, please. So business as usual, to help explain it a little bit better, we've mentioned paint the shed. There is equipment involved in some cases, and this became a little tricky because you can have equipment replacement or repair, but then on the next slide, you might see that you have an equipment replacement, but that might improve their business to be as efficient as possible. Other examples that we came across with the needs that were provided by the port directors, funding a study, which of course is important, as we now know from planning grants that are being funded through USDOT, crane mats for a sponge barge, lighting fixtures. So next slide, please. Optimizing the port efficiencies, I mentioned improving equipment in contrast to just replacing. New warehouse space, for those of you who have done capacity analysis in any fashion, even if you're doing transit and you add rail cars or lines, you're improving that capacity. In contrast to the market demand, in this case, new warehouse space, increasing static capacity, which can also help throughput capacity. Even new technologies, as we see on coastal ports, the operating systems that they can use, that any new technology, as we know now these days how fast it's jumping, can improve and help the port be more efficient, besides simple land acquisition. It depends, of course, on the purpose in this case. Is it a growth factor, or is it simply that they're helping maintain their efficiency through that acquisition? And as I mentioned earlier, and you can see here in this title, is you see the Port of Paducah with the Marine Highway grant that it received, and that white section of cement that you can see is part of that funding that helps that port remain most competitive. Next slide, please. Finally, for category 3, the preserving or capturing market position, if you're adding to the rail terminal such that you're really expanding the capacity, improving that truck access, as we used to think of it, largely still do in the maritime industry, you have your berth space, you have your apron space, you have your storage space, and then you have your landside access. So any of those elements that you significantly improve will help capture market position. The key note here, as Chandler mentioned, is that you have the factor that you're taking from other competitive ports outside the Commonwealth of Kentucky. But in addition to that, simply the factor of, in most cases, we looked at this, talked to the port directors, and a lot of it was about the expected growth in the economy in the near future as we come out of COVID, as we see things that have been very much fluctuating, very contradictory signs in some cases, but without a doubt, we're seeing improvement in many cases. So we think, despite some of the supply chain hiccups, that we're going to see growth in the long run. And that's, of course, our focus, given that we have a 25-year.
Yeah, I would say for these, you could be taking from other ports, but even more likely, you might be taking from other modes. Or if there is growth in the economy, you could be part of a business attraction that's going on, given that we saw in the economic forecast that the background growth is actually could be going down, at least in some commodities. But that, so there are a number of different sources that you could capture from there. But the point is, these are investments that you're making that are actually making a capture possible, and they're affecting the world beyond the port property.
Thank you, Jim. Next slide, please. So to help you understand, earlier we addressed the type of improvement, breaking out the port in different ways, some of the ways I just mentioned. And it's not so much to compare the ports, but you can see here, this is the needs that were provided to us. And I did color code it to help everybody out. Think of it this way. Blue is water, even though we have brown water, as we call it in the industry and inland waterways, but blue is the water. Green is land. We have red for equipment. So think of it in that most practical sense. When you look at this, black or dark gray is rail, not to say it's dirty or anything with new LNG trains, but simply that we have a somewhat comparative factor here relative to where each of these ports thinks and does understand and knows, since they know themselves, knows what their needs are. As you can see with Meade, it's about the equipment that it wants to focus on, being a smaller port. In contrast, you jump over to, for example, Henderson, and there's a lot more focus on the water side, waterfront infrastructure at play here. And then you jump over to Maysville Mason, it's about the land acquisition and what they think will help them grow the most in the long run. Now, this again is focusing on total needs. So if you want to think of it in that regard, of categories 1, 2, and 3 together. Next slide, please. So looking at possible, we mentioned federal funding sources. Jimmy will be covering this again later from a state and federal point of view. And when we looked at, just as a quick early preliminary focus on what is the amount of money they can capture, you'll see graphically in a few minutes. You look at some of these examples of these programs, some of these examples, excuse me, from advanced technology to build to infra, and this totals, and this is just a quick glance, $417 billion. So even if you take 1% of that, granted, this is not quite apples to apples. The planning grant, the 300,000, for example, would be the most any one port can get. In contrast, some of these others are the total pot of money available to that program. But it is so important to consider this of what is the potential that they can capture as a whole. That 1% being just under $430 million, that there's a lot of money out here. But the other key factor to this is it's not just about thinking operations, or another way to think of it is infrastructure. It's about thinking, well, what are the priorities? Economic development and environment, we think of a lot. There is money in the environment pot, if you will. In contrast, one of the biggest ones we think of, and that ports can take advantage of course, after disaster like we just saw come through Louisiana, but is resiliency. And the money that can be there from DHS, the Coast Guard, NOAA, for example, which is under Department of Commerce, of course, but the amount of money that is available that ports can go out and leverage based on their ability and capabilities, better said, time availability and resources to go chase this money and look at the best ways to do it, given the grant requirements that are posted. Next slide, please. So investment gaps, as I mentioned with the 4 bar charts. When you look at the business as usual, you're looking at just under 16 million, and this is by percent. But you can see how much more, and this is, each one of these is considered compared to that 1%. So you have, I guess you'd say, just what, 95%, 97% of that business as usual, the ability to capture that money. Granted, that money is an annual figure compared to the 5-year figure. So if you look at it even bigger, yes, you have a bigger amount of money that you can capture, if you want to think of it that way. That being said, optimizing the port efficiency compared to the new market position, as well as when you add these up with the 196 million, you're just under half of the total potential needs gap, if that makes any sense. In other words, you have that 417 million, comparing that to the 196. Next slide, please. So again, covering the same numbers, just so you understand the port's needs. But more importantly, when we broke out these categories, you can see we've already covered the dollar amounts, don't need to recover that. You can see the bullets, don't need to recover that. But the mere point is that the benefit cost ratios, when you break it out that way, business as usual, overall on average, you're attaining just under a 1.0 BCR. On average, for all the investments, the needs, I should say, planned investments, you have a 1.2. Excuse me. Optimizing port efficiency, a 1.7, and preserving new market position. As I said earlier, is you're spending more money, but then you're yielding greater benefits. Next slide, please. So finally, to think of it in terms of strategies, we are developing those strategies now, and we're completely want to hear your opinion and get your discussion. But in short, we have considerations. Some of those biggest considerations, we talked about origin and destination. As a lot of coastal ports think of themselves in terms of having partnering ports overseas, the same applies here. Partnering ports for ports within the river ports within Kentucky. Port of New Orleans is one of the most obvious examples for goods that are moving over back and forth to China via the Panama Canal instead of via the land bridge, taking advantage of the central Mississippi River Valley. Those goals, again, going back to the funding types, resiliency, capacity, safety, which is often aligned with security from DHS, for example, and Coast Guard, where to invest, using those categories that you saw earlier, waterfront infrastructure, rail access, the current market trends. You ask yourself, well, why would you say e-commerce? Well, without a doubt, it's growing. We never would have thought probably 20 years ago that we'd ever be willing to get something shipped to us, order it, or that Amazon would ship you something that's not the right item, they just tell you to keep it. We never would have thought that way. The market keeps changing. But the trick is, giving you 14 Amazon fulfillment centers within Kentucky is to leverage that. And what I'm getting at is when you look at the top factor, and that's why I'm working backwards, is inland water transportation market. Container and barge has long been discussed on the Mississippi, and there's different reasons that have been brought up as to why it does not operate successfully, from Corps of Engineers infrastructure to reliability. But that being said, if you look at transit services throughout the country for passengers, well, those are subsidized, all of them. The same applies here. The 64 Express was first funded by, if you don't know it, in Richmond, Virginia, was first funded by a CMAQ grant and still has relied, not to today, I don't believe, but for the first many years on a CMAQ grant operating money, as have other programs and service from Albany, New York to Port of New York. What I'm getting at is, if you establish that container on barge services, going back to what I mentioned about teamwork among the ports, like a bus route, you have a liner service, container on barge, hopping along the ports. It is known what its schedule will be. That's what shippers want. In this case, you're not moving one truck at a time. Instead, you're moving multiple containers at a time. You know, just like you waiting for the bus, that container will be, that barge, excuse me, will be there to pick up the container or drop off. That's what our system has become. It used to be about just in time. Now it's more about having that good available in some fashion, or in this case, the container, you know it's going to be there at what time. And thanks to technology, we can now track this much more. So the key issue is, as we talk about these strategies, is not waiting for things to happen. We're suggesting that the Kentucky Riverport system and the Riverport authorities that we're going to help with is being strategic, looking at strategies, moving ahead, looking at the future. But again, don't watch the rust form, right? We all joke about that. People sitting there watching a car rust. The bottom line is just to move ahead, and we're going to help them figure that out. And I believe that concludes our presentation. With any questions, I did see some pop-ups in the chat, but before we get there, I didn't know, Chandler, if you wanted to pop in on anything.
No, I think what we're really interested in, we're interested in what people think. We're interested in, addressing the questions, but also we really, again, we want for the funding strategy for the investment to really to be reflective of what everybody with an interest in this Riverport system wants to have happen here, and to be informed by all the expertise in the room and a lot of the expertise beyond the room. So we're just really interested in what everyone has to say. And I know there are already some questions, so I'll yield the floor for discussion among all the smart people here about what we learned from this, and what we can learn from the smarts in the room.
So Haley, did we want to address the questions, or did you want to direct them to us, just to clarify, or Jimmy?
Sure, we're happy to read them if you want to. Bill Kinsler says, why are rail investments or a portion thereof 16 million only contemplated for port expansion and not for port efficiency improvements?
And I think if y'all can go back to that slide where we show, so we can provide context for not only discussion, but for everybody for discussion. And that's for needs. So we want to go back to where it shows, and Bill, I don't know if you want to clarify which slide you're thinking of. Is it here?
Yeah, right there, that one.
So this is what was provided to us by the port authorities in terms of, again, this goes back to, was it simply a maintenance issue in contrast to preserve or capture market position? The answer to your question is we are obviously open to changing that. And we've been working with the directors, going back and forth of communication, and we can go back and look specifically at certain ports, or somebody thinks that there is something that's more about the efficiency. We're happy to change that. This is the first pass through, I guess you might say.
Okay, that clarifies it for me. So it is a direct input from the port directors themselves. And so it doesn't contemplate any near-term efficiency, just longer-term capture of market.
Yes, if you're thinking, I think that's a yes to your question, if I understand that very last part.
Yeah, and something I think to understand about these categories is that if there's an investment that is going to really make a port more competitive, that's going to give you a market capture opportunity, and that investment also is going to make you more efficient and allow you to operate the same service for less money, it's going to be classified into the higher category of the two. So you might have investments that are creating efficiency, but are also creating market capture. If you have a situation like that, it's going to be credited to the higher category, because it's always going to be credited to, to the greatest possible benefit. And I think a lot of the rail investments are probably like that.
Yep, and as you can see from the order of magnitude for preserving or capturing market position, giving you improving the rail access, obviously probably for markets that are greater than 300 miles away in most cases, that you're looking at 16 million. In contrast to the business as usual for some rail maintenance is only 155,000. To help clarify it.
Okay, the next question is, are the possible federal funding sources annual amounts or over other time periods?
So I think I mentioned that earlier. We are looking at the 5-year needs compared to the annual amounts. But keep in mind, these amounts being annual, being that you'd find, for example, in grants.gov, that what is listed, or better said, that if those of you are not familiar with, that the U.S. Committee on the Marine Transportation System publishes, and about every 2 years, they update a federal funding handbook that's directed at the maritime industry. It does take into account programs that are usually thought of in other modal capacities, but they are applicable to the maritime industry. So a lot of this information came from there. And I know about that funding handbook because I developed the first and second ones. I think the next one, just for your update, is due out this year or next year. I have to check with Helen, but that is a great source of information. So hope that helps.
Rich Toma just typed in a comment, missing the expanded big picture that you will not get from Port Director. Did you consider the Sulaks and Ocean class motorized barges?
Not at this time. This was focusing on the current port needs in contrast to simple barge service. Of course, we have American Patriot Holdings out there that is due to start service with its new class of vessel that, for example, something you might see over in the EU. That has been the only focus. It is not, let me clarify, focused on the type of asset necessarily. It's just considered, okay, if you have a river barge, or as originally discussed in the Marine Highway Program, a river barge that's been converted with slots for containers, and therefore what that capacity is. But that, in that case, it came into account because a port was talking about, well, we want to add some more berthing capacity, some more mooring pilings. That, well, how many more barges does that accommodate, and therefore how much more cargo in that regard? Now that's only talking about the future in the long run. If we've not gotten to that that actual container barge market yet, because that doesn't exist, in contrast to focusing on, in all cases so far, the projects boil down to two different types. They boil down to dry bulk, aggregate of some sort, energy product, for example. But then the other type of project, depending on the port, was general cargo, which in most cases, almost all cases for general cargo, was a neo bulk. And neo bulk, for those of you who don't know, is like break bulk. Break bulk's usually defined in the past as a palletized cargo, where neo bulk is something that is not palletized, but is not containerized. So two quick examples would be steel coils that some of the ports here are handling, as well as paper rolls. And I'm sure you may be familiar with the type of infrastructure, or better said, type of equipment that are used to move that.
That is all of the questions that I see at this time. If there's any additional questions, please type them into the chat or simply raise your hand and we can unmute you.
Or even to clarify is, we're going, if you don't mind, go back to that last slide just to help, or the very last slide of the presentation where we ask for questions. And what I'm getting at is the focus on, as Chandler mentioned earlier, we do want to hear from you, the idea and what you think. So the idea is talking about the strategies essentially behind this. The investment.
Yeah, so in addition to questions, if you have comments or ideas or things that you'd really like to be reading about in the final report, if anybody has, for example, if you've got particular sources of funding or opportunities or things that you would like for us as a study team to explore further, or that you would like the heads in the room to discuss further, this is a great time to bring those up too, because this is our chance to have this conversation. So we're not just looking for questions about the presentation, but also any discussion on this topic, since we have this chance to be together.
Gentlemen, can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
This is Chad Dorsey, Inland Waterways Gateway for the Maritime Administration. Just wanted to ask the question as far as the study was concerned, as as we potentially look at future improved state funding for the Riverport's improvement program or whatever that may be, has it been looked at to see how far potential funding would go as a match towards federal funding for some of your programs, like the Port Infrastructure Development Program through the Department of Transportation?
So the answer is no, but the suggestion, think of it as a suggestion more than a question, is spot on. What I mean by that is we are finishing up task memo, working on this week, task memo 4, that I think you hit it just in the perfect timing, as well as towards the final report in terms of what that match might be, like you said, in comparison to the recently closed PIDP, I can never say that well, PIDP program that Bob manages. But the other programs, of course, from Marine Highway money that used to only be initially 7 million to this most recently, I think it was 10.8, if I got the number right, how much that's grown. But the fact that it's not just about getting, if you will, the federal dollars, but about leveraging the local or state dollars. And as you know, Chad, the key factor that USDOT likes more than anything is public-private partnerships. We see those for toll road development, notably transurban in the Washington, D.C. area. But that key factor, we see it for ports with terminal operators. But the key point here is that given you have such a great system, extends out eventually to Pittsburgh, when Jim McCarville used to focus on that idea of container barge down in New Orleans so much, that without a doubt, there's that ability to think that way, the ability and the practical concept to say, what money do we have, but how can we leverage that to make it grow for an investment strategy? Thank you.
And
Just agree wholeheartedly, and just to follow on and add a little extra context, as you mentioned with public-private partnerships and whatnot, as I work through my Inland Waterways Gateway role, obviously Kentucky and the Riverports are one of my 9 state areas of responsibility. But what I've seen, specifically, with the Marine Highway Program is, a strong relationship between stakeholders not only, river ports or private terminals, but really as it comes down to the actual shippers and working with those shippers to develop potential opportunities that freight can be moved to our inland waterways through our river ports. So just wanted to tag that in as well. Thanks.
Thank you. Jimmy, you were going to make a comment?
Sure. I was just going to say, just on what Chad was asking, in the session this afternoon too, Tim Cahill and I are going to talk a little bit together from his port perspective on some of those strategies as well, and how to leverage state and local funds and what types of state and local funds are needed to meet some of those requirements. And also we break down some of those federal programs a little bit more, and even the infrastructure bill that's coming, just as it takes shape and as it's going to be filtered down to the sponsors or the organizations that will have to allocate and select projects. We'll know more, but yeah, we're going to discuss that a little bit more this afternoon as well, though, Chad. So hope you'll join us later, and we can get into a little more meat on those specific items.
I think it's a good fit, Jimmy. And I say that because in talking to Tim, what I find interesting is that, and having seen it myself, is that we all know the concept of build it and they will come. We all apply that phrase to traffic, right? You build a new corridor, you think it's going to improve it. We've now proven and seen that it really just adds more congestion because everybody jumps over to that easier route. In this case, what I'm getting at is a port can expand, and that's the assumption here to some degree, but you hit it on the head, Chad, by referencing shippers. You not only need the supply side with expanding the port, but the idea is to expand it relative to the demand for that port, and not just to try to create the demand, but look at where these shippers, where's the goods moving from and to, where they could be diverted from and to, which then goes back to the transportation user cost benefits. And therefore, how can that ultimately improve the Commonwealth of Kentucky as a whole from an economic point of view? I think, Jimmy, that being said, y'all's discussions would be great with Tim and yourself, talking about those things you just mentioned.
A couple more questions have come in, Noel and Chandler. Have you considered the head haul, back haul imbalances and the type of equipment that may move cargo into ports and out of the port synergistically? There tends to be a disconnect and a consequent imbalance both in cargo and in service equipment. Example, barge types, etc.
In the answer, Scott, I know exactly what you're talking about with the ISO and soybean, is simply that the answer is it will be considered. It has been conceptually considered so far. For example, looking at a new port such as Western Kentucky, port that doesn't exist yet. Well, of course, you have goods coming in one direction if it's coming upbound. Well, the point is that you do want to look at, as you know, and many of you may know, is the barge is coming northbound in one direction full, but then what? The same applies to trucking. So it will be looked at relative to a good that's been proposed or suggested by a port director as to a new volume of goods coming a certain direction. The idea, of course, is that it can go backhaul. That being said, for looking at the new strategy in the future, if you're talking about what I call a bus route for containers, then it's not so much about a backhaul, but about that route, and that you always have a container or 2 or 3 or 5 or 10 or 20, whatever it is as the service grows, that keep those barges, the wrong word is full, but keep them, that there are containers on those barges.
Okay, one last question. Rebecca says, Steve mentioned workforce shortfalls on yesterday's session. Was additional workforce identified as a need or fed into one of the analysis buckets?
I'm reading the question now, Haley. Thank you. The additional workforce is not so much fed into the analysis buckets as much as a result of the analysis buckets. Chandler, did you want to jump in here?
Well, that is an interesting question. Yeah, the investment package methodology right now is scoped right now looking at capital improvement, because we're looking at funding sources that are generally, that can be spent on capital improvements, and we're looking at that side of it. We're not looking at, workforce and operation type things. it would be an interesting thing to address in some way. Because my understanding is the question about workforce is, well, gosh, if the Riverports need money to attract and retain competitive staff, competitive workforce, I'm assuming that's the question is, have we looked at that as a need and how that could be covered and what you could accomplish with that? And I haven't seen transportation investment scenarios doing that, even though it would be an interesting issue to address. We'd have to think about what that looks like, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
See, did you want to clarify it, or did we hit home on that?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. And I do see Scott's comment regarding trade adjustment assistance programs, which I believe is just simply more of a comment relative to what Chandler was just saying, as well as for us to keep in mind for the development of not only task memo 4, but the final report, which essentially is task memo 5. Thank you, Scott. And of course, let me go back a step for the
Just
point
a
of
second, Noel,
Sure.
Greg, you had a question?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
I don't know whether y'all want to field it right now, but I need to tell a quick story. And then you can gauge where you want to react now to it or later on. But anyway, a scenario that's happening here in Henderson is we had a very recent announcement of a major paper plant coming into Henderson, Kentucky. Actually, Steve Alley referenced that yesterday. We talked about that paper move that was occurring up near Cincinnati. It's the same company, and they have a plan to actually build a plant in Henderson. And so I've been struggling with the notion of really a closed loop system, trying to figure out a methodology where they need basically waste paper and waste cardboard to come into that plant and process. And then on the outbound side, they're going to make finished boxes. And the question is that it seemed like to me that there may be what I would consider a domestic container scenario where you might place empty domestic containers at various locations to gather up the scrap, and then you would return completed boxes to those same locations. But I don't know how you fund that with a private-public partnership, and I don't know whether that makes any economic sense. And you know, we're struggling with the fact that, you know, I'm a one-person show and have a day job, and trying to figure out how to connect the dots for the next few days, few months, and that. And so that's a really long-term strategic issue to consider. But I'm kind of wondering if this is now a good time to kind of bring up that scenario.
Scenario. So to clarify, the scenario you're addressing obviously is the movement of paper, but the question, to make sure I understand it, because I have a few thoughts, but the question to make sure I understand it is that possible relative to moving the paper product by containers, what you're saying, but the thought of having empties strategically located, is that right?
Yeah, well, we'd be doing both. You'd be taking the you know, let's say that this paper mill ends up having certain locations that they need to deliver the finished products to. They're in the river system. So the finished product would flow out in those containers on barge. And then once those containers get there, they end up getting filled with the waste paper that they need to process and bring them back to here. So you kind of have a round turn, a closed loop. You know, and with the issue of containers as it stands right now, basically that's an export market conversation. And you know, in that scenario with exports, somebody else is always in control of the containers. But in this, what I'm trying to describe, is there a way to fund, and with, you know, with grant monies and with private parties participating, is there any logic in even considering what I just described and what I'd call a somewhat of a closed loop? You
And
know,
I'd almost have to, not to interrupt you, I'd almost have to defer to Chad, but at the same time, from my experience, having come from the Fed and developing the first and second MTS federal funding handbooks, is I think it is possible. The government does have requirements for each funding program, but at the same time, there's a little bit of flexibility in that case. So, for example, Marine Highway Program will consider a ferry service as long as it carries goods, as long as it carries, even it's been discussed and being discussed right now, whether or not that applies to last mile UPS bicycle movements, but that still qualifies as freight. So to answer your question is, I think it is possible from my experience. And as you hit it right on the head, we have another issue going on, of course, with empties being held overseas that is helping control the market, unfortunately, and therefore helping drive our rates very significantly, shipping rates, I should say. But going back to the initial part of your question is the possibility through a P3. And it's not only the factor that the federal government likes that they're not just saying here, literally 20 years ago, what I used to see was that you had the 80-20 split, and then it increased a little bit, in some cases to 90-10. But the whole idea was when you had the earmarks was, okay, I just want my 80%. And now it's gotten to be, well, this is a group focus. So how much more can you contribute? Who else is going to come to the table from the private sector, and how does it benefit them? Even though it has to go work with the public authorities. So you end up again with a P3. And I think that's what's important. And USDOT has the right focus in that regard. So to think of it from what you just suggested, the key issue, of course, is the strategic location of those containers. But the factor of what I mentioned, this is, I guess, more my own theory of the idea of that bus service, that you have, that there's a demand for that. And I think with technology, we see Uber Freight, I, without a doubt, personally see that as completely possible. Chad, did you want to jump in or not just call you out on anything, but didn't know if you had any thoughts from the federal perspective on the P3 notion or federal funding?
No, I appreciate you calling me out. Yeah, absolutely. I think, obviously if you have a shipper that has both inbound and outbound cargo and this loop that is a potential, certainly, especially for container on barge and moving that freight to the inland waterways, the Marine Highway Program is really built perfectly for that and can fund equipment for those types of project designations. And it's a three-step process for the Marine Highway Program. First step is ensuring that the freight's moving on a marine highway route. The second step in the process is creating a project designation for that project that really, as I said before, really brings together the stakeholders as far as proving that concept. And then the third step, once the project designation for that specific movement is approved by the secretary, then you move to the third step in the process, which is the grant funding portion, grant application portion, and any entity within that project designation can apply for grant funding with the permission of the public sponsor. So obviously in this case, Henderson Riverport could be a public sponsor for that project. And again, bringing that stakeholder relationship together with the shipper, your origins, destinations, potential carriers, all of those things would go into a project designation, which we have a specific Marine Highway team out in DC that can actually help with those project designations, as they don't involve grant funding at that step. So there's obviously great opportunities within that program for that specific movement or others within our marine highways.
What's interesting to add value to what Chad just said is that when the Marine Highway Program first started, it focused on the reduction of VMT with the diversion from truck. The idea was to take trucks off the road, not albeit a big number. But what I'm getting at, Chad, and you're probably aware, is that the program was expanded, which then made it eligible to OCONUS locations like Hawaii and Puerto Rico. So what I'm merely getting at, of course, is Kentucky is not OCONUS, but simply the fact that they expanded the criteria to include general benefits, public benefits. And I think that helped make the program a little bit more flexible.
that is very true, and the program can continue to expand, obviously with potential for more funding or more inclusion of other potential products. Right now, bulk commodities are not qualified for the program, but everything else, basically unitized, palletized, containerized, can be part of freight for the program.
Yeah, unitized is a good word. And I see that Mike Anders simply reiterated what Greg Pritchett had talked about. And then Bill Miller had a question regarding that. Can this be leveraged off of an existing marine highway designation? I believe so, but again, I want to turn it over to the expert. Chad, did you want to jump in this case?
Well, I won't say it publicly here that it absolutely could. We'd have to go through the project designation and through the marine highway folks in DC, but there's certainly potential that it could. We just have to run that to ground with our DC folks.
Yep, great team at Washington, DC. I know most of them are teleworking, so they also have to deal with that as well these days. I can, I guess, turn it back over to Haley, or I don't want to shortcut any discussion whatsoever.
That's all of the questions we're having.
And
Anybody else?
Yeah, I was going to clarify one thing I was going to say earlier. Sorry, Haley, is
No
simply
worries.
that, we have mentioned, and I've mentioned container on barge, but that is not the only focus here. That, as Chandler would probably agree, the idea is we're looking at strategic investments, strategies moving forward, investment strategies, whichever word you put first. And the idea is looking at this from an open-ended point of view. For example, it's mentioned here with paper product, with unitized product, or even with, given that this is not the container on barge program, for example, that looking at it from the standpoint of what makes the most sense, given that a lot of the product going into Kentucky is a bulk of some bulk form. And as Chandler noted, is we foresee that petcoke coal, for example, will be declining in the future, but at the same time, we have a lot of capacity here, and what can the ports leverage from their infrastructure, as well as Tim will address this afternoon, where he's focused on the demand side, where the shippers want to move goods, and thinking of it from that point of, well, you know, they want to move through here. There's a demand there. Shippers are telling me this and that, and I need to build to that capacity or build to accommodate that service, for example. I just want to clarify that.
Thanks. Jimmy, do you have the last slide that shows the next sessions that are coming up? We can share that with everyone.
Thank you, Haley. I was having some trouble getting my mute button to unmute. I hope y'all can see the slides if that's the case. Somebody let me know. Yeah, okay. Well, we appreciate this presentation from Chandler and Noel. It's very thought-provoking. It will continue as we move forward in finalizing the study and refine these thoughts, adding in the final strategies and objectives and tying it all together. So we want to thank both of our presenters, Noel Cuomo and Chandler Duncan, for their hard work. Wanted to go ahead and tell you all that we'll give you about 15 minutes extra. So you'll get a 45-minute break before we move into our last session of the day, which is going to be funding programs, Riverport capital improvement needs, and discussion with Port Director Tim Cahill on funding strategies. And I think it's going to be a really good session. It's going to kind of put a bow on what was introduced here by Chandler and Noel, dive in a little deeper to some of those programs and some of those strategies, that not just the investment strategies, but what are the technical strategies that the ports can utilize, both from Tim's experience in the port industry throughout the world, and then some of my experience with other states, helping them set up funding programs related to the maritime industry. So that's what's coming this afternoon. We definitely want your participation and look forward to it. And we'll give you guys back 15 minutes of your day. And we thank you and see you in 45 minutes.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, everybody.